Well, you mentioned Afghanistan, and I saw that obviously, for a woman or, as a woman, seeing last week in the news that the burqa is now back on the list for all women in Afghanistan. I thought, all those guys and women who fought there, and this is what, we're left with. Well, Trish, in Iraq, our friend Saddam was a loathsome creature. I don't think very many would dispute that point. On the other hand, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah. And he got a lot of other things right in terms of controlling those kinds of matters and creating the opportunity for women to get an education, to advance, and to play a role in society. I was just distressed on a scale that you can't imagine when I saw that Islam had been enshrined in the new Iraqi constitution that people from in-state had put together. That ultimately Islam is the inspiration for and the final word in all matters pertaining to the law in Iraq. Yeah, do these things ever end well for women, do they? That's the issue, Trish, is that why we went? Yeah. I mean, that's incredible. We could have put in any number of people to replace Saddam and his family and then essentially said, look, we're going south of Euphrates. If you need any help from us, let us know, but what we really want you to do is to do business with us and get out of this business of threatening your neighbors, and as long as you do that, we'll do business with you. If we had done that, not only would we probably have saved 1 million lives, but imagine how much better the situation in that country would have been for the people that lived there. Yeah, it's a shocking failure that was. I could talk to you for all day about the Coalition Provisional Authority and stuff like that, like the Green Zone, remember? Yeah, and anyway, I want to get into some of the more granular stuff about Ukraine because it's hard to find it anywhere else. So I'll just kind of do like a lightning round. Who's winning? Russians. And the Russians have been dominating the situation strategically and operationally almost from the beginning, despite the obvious problems and difficulties that they had at the outset. And I think that truth is becoming harder and harder to suppress. Now, when we say winning, we're talking about what happens when the Russians and the Ukrainian forces encounter each other. In all but very few cases, the Russians crush the Ukrainians. When you're in a position to dominate your enemy, you don't withdraw into cities and create mini fortresses, stock them with ammunition, food, and supplies and hope that you can outlast the people that are on the outside. That's not a prescription for victory. Napoleon said the enemy who stays within his fortifications is beaten, where the Ukrainians have been staying in their fortifications almost from the beginning. So the answer to the question is militarily, operationally, and strategically the Russians. And so they now have, I pulled up my little map here. They pretty much have all of that Donbass area that they wanted in Crimea. But that didn't happen as quickly as one would have expected. Why do you think they didn't just come in and grab it in a very aggressive way? I mean, they seemed at the beginning of this to be pussyfooting a bit, didn't they? Well, Teresa, I was in for a lot of criticism when I was interviewed very early in the morning. I don't know what you're like, but I'm a night person. I'm not an early morning person, and this was at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was talking to someone on Fox Business, and he asked the question somewhat like you, and I said, well, I think they were too gentle at the beginning, and the word I was looking for was not gentle, it was restrained. Yeah, I think that there are two things that happened. First of all, the Russians forgot what they were dealing with, the majority of the Russians who live in eastern Ukraine, and that's where the Russians are now. They were very suspicious of the Russian intervention because the Russians from the very beginning had said we are coming in to eliminate the Ukrainian threat and we basically want the following three things. We want neutrality for Ukraine. We want the Donbass and Luhansk republics to have autonomy or independence within Ukraine and rights for Russian-speaking or culturally Russian citizens, and we want recognition of Russia's legitimate claim to Crimea. Those are the basic objectives. We are not coming to seize territory, and we are not staying. Well, that was a mistake, Trish, because if you're a Russian in eastern Ukraine, first of all, you're a second-class citizen and have been for certainly since 2014. Some would say earlier. And you see the Russian army is coming in, but they've made it very clear they're not staying. So then you say, well, I'm not going to help these people. I'm not going to work with these people because if they're, and I do anything, the Ukrainian secret police will show up after they're gone and put a bullet through my head and kill all of my family. So tens of thousands, if not a million people easily, that would have actively supported and cooperated did not because they didn't want to end up dead in the long run. So that was the first mistake. The second, I think you can argue that yes, they should have come in on a defined axis and they probably should have concentrated forces in a few key areas sooner, but I don't think that was their objective. I think they really thought that once they moved in and isolated these Ukrainian forces that QF would negotiate, and they had some evidence to believe that in the first 3 weeks, and then of course it became clear that they were not really fighting the Ukrainian or compelling the Ukrainian government to do anything. They were up against us. And of course, by that time it was too late. They had gone in under a false set of assumptions. They had to change their assumptions. And what you see now is the result of those modifications and changes. Do you think Zelensky would have behaved differently or been more compliant if this narrative of the heroic Ukrainian people against the forces of Nazi and darkness from Russia had not taken place? Do you think I don't really know anything about him? I sort of see him. He clearly loves the limelight and has adapted to this role that he knows America wants him to play. But do you, based on what you know about him, do you think if we had not had this massive propaganda campaign that he would have gone to the table and said, yeah, you can have that and I'm not going to push for NATO status? Which I think he actually said to I read in the Ice and Sprons press. I swear I read this that he, and it didn't get a lot of publicity, but that he said several weeks ago he was cool with some kind of arrangement around the eastern part of the country. And then that NATO was not a necessity for him anymore. And then that just went away. Like people just stuck. What happened there? I think Washington with its trusty ally in London said no. You will fight until we tell you to stop. And I really think that to fully answer the question about Zelensky, you've got to ask the question, how does a comedian/drag queen come from anonymity out of nowhere to become what he is? Well, obviously, he has the backing of this man Kolomoisky. Yeah. Who is a very character, this oligarch, the man who is funding all of these bizarre Nazi-style formations. And as I tell people all the time, we really need to stop using these terms Nazi and communist because nothing happening today has anything to do with that. But unfortunately, we have a lot of people today who look back on the past, don't understand what really did happen. Yeah. And they sort of usurp control of these symbols, which is what I think has happened, and the symbols become a justification for hate and murder and so forth. But you know what's the story on this man? I think you've got it right. I watched it very carefully. It was clear to me that he was receptive to neutrality and to what you just described in eastern Ukraine. The outstanding question was this business of Crimea. And again, I've come under attack because I've tried to say repeatedly that any Ukrainian claim on Crimea is historical. Until 1776, when the Russian armies finally moved into Crimea, it was a Mongol-Tatar Khanate and a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire. But since 1776, it's been dominated largely by the Russians and controlled and governed by them, and they have a large Russian population there. And if you don't like that, well then, it would make more sense to meet with Mr. Erdogan, who probably is the current leader of Turkey, has a greater claim to the place than the Ukrainians. So, there's no understanding of the region, its history, the people that live there. We don't know anything about it. And that's the problem, so that we sort of dismiss out of hand uncomfortable historical realities that don't fit within the narrative that's being created. And this brings us back to the issue that we began with. Narrative. We've created a narrative. And anyone who challenges the narrative is the enemy, is the traitor, is evil, is like the people that he is theoretically defending. I'm not defending the Russians. I'm simply saying I'm an American. I'm not involved in this. I don't want to be involved in this. But I know how explosive the region is. Therefore, as an American, I have an interest in bringing this conflict to an end on the best terms that we can get for both sides in the hopes of avoiding any future conflict in the region. That's it. That's all that we, as should be interested in. I would think that Canadians would feel similarly. But we have no interest in going into this fight or in keeping it going in perpetuity. And I think NATO is going to be torn apart. Largely because we don't want to stop. And the Germans aren't going to go along with it. I can tell you that this Annalena Baerbock, who is the German foreign minister, she's attracted a lot of attention. She's a little crusader who wants to right all the world wrongs in the world and has decided to become part of the Russian hate club. And she was speaking a couple of days ago. I think it was in northwest Germany. She was pelted with eggs. And the population kept calling her a warmonger. Wow! Get out of here! Of course, there's no interest in going to war in Ukraine under any circumstances by virtually anybody in NATO with a possible exception of the Poles. And we know from the latest polling data, 60% of the Poles have said they don't support a conflict with Russia. So it's back to your other question. At the beginning, we have governments that are pushing for things that the electorates don't really want and don't really support. And that aren't the humane answer, right? The only thing that matters is how do we end it? What's the outcome? And the fact that legacy media is not focused on that and is allowing people both here and in the States too to be carried away with this idea of a romantic fight against this terrible person no matter how many lives it takes, is one of the biggest abdications of moral responsibility I think in history. I have never seen a propaganda campaign like this, and I've seen many. This one is just like a fire hose. Trish, you're right. I must say that this is astonishing to me, and I remember in 2003 the tremendous press offensive that went on. You'll recall Condoleezza Rice talking about a mushroom cloud over Washington. Yeah. And I thought that was over the top and crazy. But compared with that, this is truly being infinitely worse. Well, because they're doing it's kind of interesting. They're doing the same thing that they did with some of the COVID public health policies, that if you don't go along with this, you're a bad person. And people are very, very easily captured by that right now. It's a bigger cultural discussion I'd love to have with you one day, but people's lives are meaningless. So they grab onto these things and don't really think them through. But anyway, I want to just finish because I know we're running out of time, but I want to kind of finish my lightning round for people who are really keen to have the latest kind of information. So Russia's going to win in your view. When will that be? What will that look like? Well, Russia is already beginning to consolidate its administrative control of parts of eastern Ukraine, and the area where they are operating now has always been Russian. I think you're going to see a line eventually develop just a little west of Kharkov that runs south almost like the top of a banana and then cuts across eastern Ukraine to the Dnieper River somewhere south of Kiev. And that banana-like construct on the ground will become the new Ukrainian Republic or part of Russia. I don't know precisely how it will work, but I think something like that will occur. And as I pointed out before, we won't support any negotiated outcome because we've said it's unconditional surrender. We've told Putin either you surrender unconditionally or we'll destroy you. The problem with the second part of the equation, we'll destroy you, is that by this summer, I think we'll be focused on all the things we discussed earlier. So, I think it'll just end up being a de facto partition of Ukraine along the lines that I just described, and that it will sit there. Then the question is, what do the Europeans do? This is where I think the Germans and the French, in particular, also the Italians, Greeks, and others, will have to stand up and say, wait a minute, this has got to end, we've got to do business. Remember, as much as we have decided now that China is next on the menu, and that we hate China, the truth is Europeans want to do business with the Chinese, and the Chinese are happy to do business with them. One of the things the Chinese want to do is complete this one belt, one road across Central Asia that reaches through Ukraine and Russia to Europe. And Europeans are going to say, that's not going to happen as long as we're engaged in these wars. Now, we may think that it's in our interest for this to never happen and, therefore, we want to keep the pot boiling. But I don't think the Europeans, long term, are going to put up with that. That's why I warned from the beginning that I thought this could tear NATO apart because our interests and European interests are not identical. The Europeans really do want stability and peace in Europe, and we've been on the side of instability and conflict in Europe. The two are incompatible. And Finland, though, now is trying to go for NATO membership, right? As of a couple of days ago? Well, actually, you bring this up, Mike. I don't have too many contacts in Finland, and I do have more contacts in Sweden, but my impression is that if you put it to a vote or referendum in Sweden, the Swedish population would not support NATO membership. Oh, really? And why would that be? Well, they don't see any real need for it. Yeah. And again, all of this is based on the propaganda that Russia is this looming aggressive power ready to march on Europe when there's no evidence for that and there's no capability for it. You know, when you look at an enemy, you look at the force structure, and you try to derive from the force structure what you think the intention is. Well, if you look at the Russian force structure, it doesn't have the capacity to attack Western Europe. It's impossible. And that's what people don't seem to understand. I mean, sort of like, you know, Saddam Hussein's non-existent mushroom cloud. You have the same thing right now with Russia. There's a non-existent threat there. And they say, well, if we don't destroy them now, eventually, they'll come back and they'll do more. Well, Russia's taken 30 years to sort of fall apart, crash, and gradually recover. I don't see a great deal changing in the short term, but there is one thing that's worth keeping in mind, Trish. I do want to say this before you go. People have decided to demonize Vladimir Putin. I don't know the man, I've never met him. But I know a little bit about the people in line to replace him, who could, and Vladimir Putin is a rare bird because he's actually been, from the very beginning, very pro-Western, and he understands the West. He lived outside of Russia, outside of the Soviet Union, and he's a Renaissance man compared to anyone standing in line to replace him. Yikes! Well, you know, the total cognitive dissonance created by their position is that on one hand, they say Putin's crazy, and then on the other hand, they say, but we know he won't use nuclear weapons. And I'm like, well, how do you kind of measure those two things? How do you square that? That just makes no sense. Listen, you're right. And I also will say that I totally blame Hillary Clinton for this because blame her for everything in the foreign policy sphere. But I was reading about her over the last couple of days in anticipation of speaking to you, and you know she was gunning for this after the reset button, you know, stupidity failed. She really started on a campaign of wanting to engage militarily with Russia. There's a piece in Foreign Policy magazine where she was calling for a no-fly zone over Syria and various things like, and of course, she did the Russia hoax and the Putin's puppet and all that kind of stuff. She, more than any other living in my view, is responsible for where we are. Well, Trish, you may well be right. I really haven't studied her in particular, and that may be accurate. One of the things that I would say, though, is this. You know, certainly if you go back to the early 60s when the Vietnam debacle got off the ground. Yeah. We had Harold Macmillan in London. And there was a great effort undertaken in Washington to drag the British into Vietnam. And he said no. And I forgot the name of the Prime Minister who preceded Trudeau at the time in Canada, but the Canadians said no as well. Yeah, we didn't go. And frankly, you know, I always thought that London and Ottawa were useful counterbalances to Looney Tunes in Washington. Yeah. That you could turn to the British and the Canadians and say, you know, we're thinking about doing X, and someone up there in Ottawa or someone in London would say, well, that's all very well and good, but I think you've lost your, and these are the reasons why you shouldn't do it. Yeah. That doesn't exist now. I know it doesn't. Have anybody we can turn to? No, I know, and you know what I blame for that. I blame globalism for that, right? Like the loyalty is no longer to a cultural identity, especially in Canada. I'm doing a show next week with an immigrant who is sorry she came here because it's not the Canada she thought she was coming to, right? And I do think that the globalist agenda has nullified the idea that foreign policy decisions are based on what the public might support or not support based on our national, right? I just don't think they care what we think anymore. Well, I think that's probably true. One last point on Canada. I was taken as a young man to Expo 67 in Montreal, and the principal reason I was taken up there was to see the mast pipes and drums of the Canadian Armed Forces. And there were tears in my grandparents' eyes because they said, we want you to see the great Canadian Army before it's destroyed. And of course, they were heartbroken that the Union Jack was removed from the Canadian flag because they thought that was an important distinction. Yeah, it separated Canadians from Americans. And they tended to view Canada once again, much as I have historically viewed it along with London, as a sort of voice of reason that would stand up and sort of help us navigate the troubled waters of being a superpower. I don't think I just want to think our Prime Minister thinks that way anymore. And I actually have it on good authority because I interviewed his brother. And he said that he loves being part of the G7. He really digs the motorcades. He wants to be part of that. No, seriously. He was a drama teacher, right? Like he's not the deepest guy, right? So that's the pull of this. That it's more about, I feel sometimes, his relationships with other world leaders and with the kind of WEF crowd than it is with us. That's my sense of it. So that's great. Everybody wants to go to the divorce conference in Switzerland, right? Yeah, I'm becoming a one-issue voter on that actually. I think that anybody who's doing that is not worthy of my vote. I'm sick of it all. You know I'm really sick of it, as I'm sure you people are too. Down there. Well, it's possible to be a good American and a good Canadian or a good British citizen and still support global stability, peace, and prosperity. The notion that you have to shed your national identity in order to be someone who supports global peace, stability, and prosperity is nonsense. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. Yeah, absolutely true.